What if investigators discovered that a teenager had allegedly been using ChatGPT to explore stories about killing his own family, and then 2 members of that family were found dead? That is the disturbing question surrounding 17-year-old Arjun Aravind, who is accused of killing his 45-year-old mother, Sudha Venkatesan, and his 14-year-old brother, Siddharth Aravind, inside their Acton, Massachusetts home. Prosecutors say investigators uncovered concerning internet activity involving ChatGPT and alleged fantasies about killing his family.
Using the internet and ChatGPT to make searches for theoretical ideas or fantasy stories regarding the killing of his family.
But let me make one thing clear before we go any further. Those are allegations from prosecutors. Arjun has pleaded not guilty, and he has not been convicted of these crimes. The online activity being discussed is also not, by itself, proof that an actual murder was planned. So what exactly happened inside this Massachusetts home? What did investigators find? And why did a teenager who was allegedly exploring these disturbing scenarios suddenly become the person police accused of killing 2 members of his own family? That's what we're going to break down. Before we continue, make sure you like this video, subscribe to Case Watch, and click the bell icon so you don't miss our latest true crime stories and updates. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The story begins in Acton, Massachusetts, a suburban community located outside Boston. At the center of the case was a family living together in what, from the outside, appeared to be an ordinary home. There was 45-year-old Sudha Venkatesan, her younger son, 14-year-old Siddharth Aravind, and her older son, 17-year-old Arjun Aravind. On Tuesday, August 11, 2026, something happened inside that home that would leave Sudha and Siddharth dead and send investigators searching for Arjun. The day reportedly began without any obvious sign that a tragedy was about to unfold. Arjun's father left the home at around 7 in the morning. Siddharth later went to a recreational facility and returned home around midday. But sometime after that, the family's ordinary routine came to a horrifying end. And for investigators, the first major clue that something was wrong didn't come from a dramatic witness seeing a crime. It came from people simply being unable to reach the family. A tutor who was expected at the house reportedly arrived, but could not make contact with anyone inside. Then Arjun's father became concerned because he was unable to reach his family. So police were contacted. The request was essentially a welfare check. Officers needed to find out why nobody was answering. But when they arrived at the home shortly before 6:40 that evening, they discovered something far more serious. 2 people were dead. Siddharth was found on the first floor. His mother, Sudha, was found in the basement. Authorities said both victims had suffered obvious trauma, and prosecutors later described evidence of a violent struggle inside the home. The exact official cause of death was still pending the medical examiner's findings. Court TV. And then investigators realized something else. Arjun wasn't there. The 17-year-old was missing. So was his mother's 2014 green Honda Accord. At that moment, police had a double homicide investigation and a missing teenager. And they needed to find him, because there was now a critical question hanging over the entire investigation. Where had Arjun gone? Had he left before police arrived? Was he another potential victim? Or did he know something about what had happened to his mother and younger brother? Investigators began searching for him, and within hours they would find him. But finding Arjun would not end the mystery. It would lead investigators to another part of the case, one involving his movements, his mother's vehicle, and eventually his digital activity. And according to prosecutors, that digital trail contained some of the most disturbing information they had uncovered. But before we get there, there's something important to understand. At this stage, investigators still had to reconstruct what happened inside that house. They had 2 victims. They had a teenager who had disappeared. They had a vehicle that was gone. And they had a crime scene that appeared to show signs of violence. But they did not yet have a complete explanation for how the tragedy unfolded. That meant every detail mattered. Where had each family member been that day? When was each person last known to be alive? What happened between the time Siddharth returned home and the moment police arrived? And why did Arjun leave? Those questions would become central to the investigation. Because in a case involving family members, motive can be one of the hardest things to understand. Why would someone allegedly turn against the people closest to them? Was there an argument? Was there a conflict nobody outside the family knew about? Had there been warning signs? Or was something happening beneath the surface that only became visible after the killings? At that point, investigators weren't publicly answering those questions. They were still collecting evidence, and they were about to learn more, because the search for Arjun was already underway. And somewhere about 13 miles away, police would eventually locate the teenager. But what happened when they found him? Why was he inside his mother's car? What evidence did investigators say they recovered? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly did prosecutors claim they discovered about his online activity before the killings? Those are the questions that take us into the next part of this case. Because the moment Arjun was found, the investigation changed. The search was over. But the real mystery was only beginning. The search for Arjun did not last long into the next morning. At around 3:40 a.m. Wednesday, police responding to an unrelated business alarm in Wayland spotted the green Honda Accord belonging to Arjun's mother. Arjun was inside the vehicle, and officers took him into custody without incident. Wayland is roughly 13 miles from the family's home in Acton, so the teenager police had been searching for was found. But now investigators had an even bigger question to answer. What had happened between the time Arjun allegedly left the family home and the moment officers found him sitting inside his mother's car? According to prosecutors, investigators found a number of items inside that vehicle that they said corresponded with the murder scene. Authorities have not publicly released every detail about those items, and they have also not publicly identified the weapon or weapons they believe were used. And this is where the case began moving from a search for a missing teenager into a much deeper investigation. Police had already found Sudha and Siddharth suffering from obvious trauma. Prosecutors later described the incident as involving a physical and violent struggle. But the official cause of death was still pending the medical examiner's determination. That meant investigators were still trying to establish exactly how the two victims died, what happened inside the house, and how the evidence at the home connected to what they had found in the car. And then there was Arjun himself. He was only 17. Yet he was now facing accusations involving the deaths of his own mother and younger brother. When investigators began looking into his activities before the killings, prosecutors say they discovered something that immediately raised questions. According to Middlesex District Attorney Marian Ryan, Arjun had recently demonstrated what she described as concerning behavior. Investigators allegedly found internet searches and ChatGPT activity involving theoretical ideas and fantasy stories about the killing of his family.
Including using the internet and ChatGPT to make searches for theoretical ideas or fantasy stories regarding the killing of his family.
Police have not said how the victim...
But what exactly does that mean? This is where we need to be careful, because headlines can make this sound much simpler than it actually is. Authorities have not said that ChatGPT instructed Arjun to kill anyone. They have not publicly released the full conversations. And they have not established that every disturbing story or question he allegedly entered into the system was a literal murder plan. What prosecutors have said is that investigators found material they considered concerning because it appeared to involve fictional scenarios in which his family did not survive. Ryan described some of the material as resembling Gothic-style stories, with Arjun allegedly asking questions about characters and hypothetical situations involving his family. And now, think about the timing. Investigators are looking at alleged fictional stories about family members dying. Then they discover that two of those family members are actually dead. That doesn't automatically prove intent, but it certainly gives investigators something they need to examine. And that's exactly what they were doing. They weren't simply asking, did Arjun use ChatGPT? They were trying to understand why. What was he writing? When did he write it? How often did he search for this type of material? Was there anything in those conversations that suggested a real-world plan? Or were these simply disturbing fictional fantasies that had nothing to do with what happened in the house? Those distinctions could become extremely important as the case moves through court. Because prosecutors cannot simply point to disturbing internet activity and say that it proves murder. They still have to establish the crime itself and connect the evidence to Arjun beyond a reasonable doubt. And Arjun's defense will have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of that digital evidence. There is another reason the online activity has attracted so much attention. This is not just a case about a teenager and a family tragedy anymore. It has also become a conversation about artificial intelligence. Millions of people use AI systems to write fictional stories, explore ideas, ask strange questions, or simply experiment with different scenarios. So when investigators discover disturbing fictional material after a violent crime, How should that material be interpreted? Is it evidence of intent? Is it a warning sign? Or can it sometimes be nothing more than fiction? Those are complicated questions, and this particular case may eventually force a courtroom to examine them in much greater detail. But before any of that could happen, Arjun had to face the charges. On Thursday, August 13th, he appeared in Concord District Court. He was brought into court in handcuffs, and the charges were serious. Arjun was accused of 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of his mother and brother. He also faced additional charges, including assault and battery involving a household or family member, assault and battery, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, and theft of a motor vehicle. A not guilty plea was entered on his behalf, and the judge ordered that he remain held without bail. It means the case is nowhere near finished. There has been no trial, there has been no conviction, and there has been no final court finding that Arjun committed the murders. For now, he is an accused defendant who has pleaded not guilty. That is important because the public already knows some disturbing details, but there are still many things investigators have not revealed. For example, what was the murder weapon? Authorities have not publicly identified it. What exactly caused Sudha and Siddharth's deaths? The official medical findings were still pending in the initial proceedings. What happened during the critical hours between Siddharth returning home around noon and the discovery of the bodies that evening? Investigators have not publicly provided a complete minute-by-minute account. And what exactly was happening between Arjun and his family before August 11th? That may be one of the most important questions of all, because prosecutors have pointed to concerning behavior in the months leading up to the killings. But concerning behavior is not the same thing as a proven motive, and that's where the investigation becomes much more complicated. Imagine being a parent and discovering after a tragedy that your teenager had allegedly been exploring disturbing stories about the deaths of family members. Would you immediately understand what those conversations meant? Or would you think it was just dark fiction? Would you know whether your child was asking for help? And if you didn't know, could anyone have known? Those questions are painful because we are looking at the case after the tragedy. We know how the story allegedly ended, but the people around Arjun did not have that information beforehand. They were living their lives without knowing what investigators would later discover. And that is one of the biggest mysteries still surrounding this case. Were there warning signs that could have been recognized? Or are people now interpreting earlier behavior differently simply because they know what happened? That's something investigators, prosecutors, and eventually the defense may all have to examine. And then there's the question of motive. At this point, authorities have not publicly established a definitive motive for the killings. We know the victims were members of Arjun's immediate family. We know police found evidence of what prosecutors described as a violent struggle. We know Arjun was allegedly found in his mother's vehicle several hours later. We know prosecutors say investigators uncovered concerning online activity. But those facts still don't answer the simplest question. Why? Why would a 17-year-old allegedly kill his mother and 14-year-old brother? Was there an argument? Was there resentment? Was there an emotional or psychological crisis? Was there something happening inside the family that outsiders didn't know about? Or is there another explanation that investigators have not yet made public? Right now, it would be irresponsible to choose one of those explanations and present it as fact. The evidence has to speak for itself, and that's what the upcoming legal process will be about. The prosecution will have to present its evidence. The defense will have an opportunity to challenge that evidence. And eventually, if the case proceeds to trial, a jury could be asked to decide whether the evidence proves the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. For now, though, the case remains in its early stages. And that means more information could still emerge. More forensic findings, more digital evidence, more interviews, more information about the family's history, and potentially more details about what investigators say happened during those critical hours inside the Acton home. But regardless of what happens in court, the human side of this case remains devastating. Sudha Venkatesan was 45 years old. Siddharth was 14. He was a child. And the family is now dealing with the loss of 2 people at once while the surviving 17-year-old faces the most serious allegations of his life. For the community of Acton, this is also the kind of case that can leave people asking whether something so terrible could happen in a place they considered safe. And for families everywhere, there is another uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes the warning signs people recognize in hindsight are not obvious while they are actually happening. A teenager might write something disturbing. They might become withdrawn. They might behave differently. They might explore dark subjects online, but not every disturbing thought becomes a real-world act. So how does a parent know when something has crossed the line? When does curiosity become a warning sign? When does fiction become something that needs to be taken seriously? And perhaps most importantly, how do we help young people who may be struggling before their problems become a crisis? Those questions go beyond this one case. But they are now part of the conversation surrounding Arjun Aravind. And as this case moves forward, one thing will matter more than speculation: evidence. Because ultimately, the court will not be deciding whether the story sounds disturbing. It will be deciding what actually happened. Arjun has pleaded not guilty. He remains in custody without bail. And the investigation and legal process are continuing. But there is still one question that I think is going to stay with many people following this case. If the allegations about Arjun's online activity are proven to be accurate, were those conversations a warning that someone should have recognized? Or were they simply dark thoughts that nobody could reasonably have predicted would become connected to a real tragedy? And if someone close to you began showing similar warning signs, would you recognize them before it was too late? Those are difficult questions, but I want to hear what you think. Do you believe disturbing online behavior involving violence should always be treated as a serious warning sign? And do you think artificial intelligence should play a role in identifying potentially dangerous behavior, or would that create another set of problems? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you want us to keep following this case as new evidence and court developments emerge, make sure you subscribe to Case Watch, like this video, and click the bell icon so you don't miss the next update.